the programs and initiatives that we really need to pay attention to and follow, so that we are able to see where our countries fit into all of this. And talk a little bit about what we've been doing in Barbados and the role of science, which is really at the core of what we do in Barbados. And I'll present a few gaps in terms of what we see, where we see we need to go, and perhaps look at how we can get there, perhaps with some very strategic partnerships. So when we talk about climate, I think what comes to mind when we talk about climate is temperature, wind, regardless of whether it's rainwater, rainfall, flooding, kind of thing, frequency, duration, volume of water, and wind, speed. When we're talking about ocean and coastal climate, it's exactly the same. We're talking about more about the sea surface temperature because that has the greatest impact on what we see on land. Also, now we're talking about seawater in the form of currents and waves, frequency of these waves, the duration, the height of the waves, the direction they're coming from, and of course the driver of these waves is the wind. We get in the Caribbean or the surface of the ocean are wind-driven waves. And so we want to understand the wind regime as well in the region, which really is influenced by what occurs in the North Atlantic as well as what obtains in the Caribbean Sea. So my former boss, who was director of the Coastal Zone Management Unit, I was hired more than 20 years ago. He is one of the lead authors who works with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and brings out all that wonderful science on the variability and the changes that we're seeing in climate globally. And this is really a quote from him, that there's really no disagreement among scientists about whether the world has become quantifiably warmer or whether the global climate system is changing. That is very obvious, I think, to most of us. But the only area of contention, I believe that this handful of skeptics is getting smaller and smaller, is the cause of the warming. The cause is global climate change, which means we're seeing a complete shift that may affect us for thousands of years, or whether we are seeing variability in the climate that may affect us for hundreds of years, really matter in terms of the small island developing states, the coastal tourism for our economic and social well-being, in part. We still have to deal with the effects of that we're seeing in our, and so some of the that we see in relations. Our temperature, of course, at the heart of this is increased CO2 levels. We're seeing an increased sea surface temperature. Remember when I joined the Coastal Zone Management Unit many years ago now, and always diving in long sleeve suit. Years ago, I'm diving in August, and the uncomfortably hot. 80 degrees, 60 feet depth. We was in 20 Celsius water. It was unprecedented. I had never expected that the temperature at that kind of depth could have changed by that amount in a couple decades. So we've seen some major changes in sea surface temperature. Hurricane intensity Of course, we've also noted we've had some really big events, events in the Caribbean that really turned the tide of economic development for some of our countries. The size is perhaps, at it in absolute terms, maybe quite small. The impact, the potential impacts, even on the impacts that we see from hurricanes, is significant. Now, we're an additional emerging impact that we don't know a lot about, but we're learning very quickly about it, and that's ocean acidification. Come back to the impacts of ocean acidification on some of our natural assets. The manifestations of these changes that we're seeing is that natural assets are being stressed or lost, which means that we have an increased vulnerability to hazards. In terms of ocean acidification, anything that has a shell that requires carbonate, calcium carbonate, in order to be fixed, and the shells have to be hard, like coral reefs, for example, like crustaceans. We're seeing more and more of vulnerability to this acidification that is actually causing a weakening effect on the shells of these organisms. And of course, that has major impacts for our economic sectors again, fisheries and tourism. Now, what I'm trying to do here during this presentation is to kind of weave together three well-known pillars of sustainable development in the Caribbean. And I'm talking about all three of those pillars and throughout the talk, even though, of course, I'm focusing on science as the bedrock for coastal and ocean management in the region, and I still think that that is the case. We're also seeing increased coastal flooding from the ocean. So prior to this, we were more accustomed to inland flooding or rainfall and then stream discharge to coastal areas. Increased inundation from the ocean affecting key coastal infrastructure, and again, we're focusing on tourism-dependent Caribbean islands, and it's coastal tourism. We're looking at urban centers. Many of the capitals of small and developing states in the Caribbean region are on the coast. Many airports, of course, our seaports can't be anywhere else. So we're talking about economic social infrastructure that is being affected little by little in countries, the region. We're more and more cliff erosion, and of course, most of our countries, not all, but most of our countries are selling our beaches. They go to the international market and begin to market our countries for coastal tourism. We have some challenges for us. However, I participated this week in the United Nations informal consultative process on the oceans and law of the sea, United Nations in New York, and I met a Swedish ambassador for ocean, seas, and fresh water. And this is one of her direct quotations from her talk there. That ocean is a resource for future generations. The blue frontier brings many opportunities and challenges. Now, that's exactly what I believe. And of course, she and I have a lot more talking to do on this issue, because I believe that, as mentioned at the beginning, some of what we're going to deal with our challenges are to forge strategic partnerships with those who may be ahead of us in terms of addressing some of these issues. And the economic and social aspects of dealing with the oceans to the heart of our economies, really: food security, energy, how we manage our waste. We've got issues, but there are also some opportunities there as well, driving our economies. Ship transportation, and then we've got some security aspects, of course, that we need to address as well. So, it's of sustainable development of the oceans and coasts. These are some of the issues that must be considered as we move forward. Actions that are occurring at the global level, and if all of them by any means, there are three of them that I believe that for this year, especially 2015, that we need to participate in, keep our eye on, and have input to as small and developing states, vulnerable economies in the Caribbean, is that the community is negotiating a new development agenda, a new global development agenda post-2015. First time they agreed on a standalone goal on oceans. The Sustainable Development Goal number 14 says that the global community, the global community agrees to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Now, language for Sustainable Development Goal 14. However, what agreed are targets associated with that Sustainable Development Goal, and means of implementation are still being discussed. They're wide open for us to have input to. And I think that this is a major step forward in our management of the oceans of the earth. The fact that we're going to see a concerted effort on the part of all member states, both and non-coastal in my view, because of course, even landlocked countries have a stake in ensuring that areas are managed sustainably. Action number one, I believe we need to keep our eye on, expected that there will be a Sustainable Development Summit in the latter half of the year. These goals will be agreed, approved, with their targets and means of implementation. Now, number two that I've identified, of course, hopefully the one that we know very well, and that's the climate change conference of the parties that will occur in Paris at the end of the year. With many of the changes that we've talked about in relation to and coastal climate are being driven global change. Questions are, will we get agreement on emissions reduction? What do we as small island developing states need to do to ensure that an agreement? Member states who are able to do so, not just funding, as done at the Copenhagen Summit and others, but a lot of that are to work alongside already impacted island developing states like the Caribbean. Technical support and technology transfer to assist. These are some of the negotiations that I think we need to to on and begin to influence those discussions. The function that I'd like to mention is ocean assessment. Now I'm working with the World Ocean Assessment, but the UN General Assembly, who will ultimately approve those Sustainable Development Goals I have been discussing. It is also the UN General Assembly, our countries among others, who will approve the first ever World Assessment document. Now, this global ocean assessment is to be the beginning of what they are calling a regular process. So that and they have to agree to this, every period, and I don't know how long it will be, it could be maybe every 10 years, but under world assessment, share what they see as the condition of the world's oceans in 10 years to what they saw in the previous assessment, and then a continual process. So ocean assessment represents a checkpoint, shall we say, where all the member states will take off and look at what our collective decisions with oceans. Actually, there are major issues, negative impacts on the oceans of decisions that have been taken by the next World Ocean Assessment. We'll be able to see some improvement because we've been able to change the decision. We've been able to make more scientifically based decisions regarding the oceans. We're able to put regulations in place in order to alleviate some of the challenges and mistakes that we've made in terms of the use of the oceans. So the ocean assessment I see as a tool that can be used to ensure that our policymakers make more informed decisions. Three global actions that I've put in this talk, it diminishes the actions of many of the other globes that are going on and initiatives. However, of course, I'm limited by time, so I've just highlighted these three. A number of regional actions that are going on as well, but I wanted to draw attention to the convention and its protocols, which specifically to the marine environment and the protection and development, which speaks to this issue of sustainable development of the marine environment, as well as the projects of the UNESCO IOC's regional secretariat, IOCARIBE. Now, of course, one of the initiatives of the UNESCO program right now is the Caribbean Large Marine Ecosystem Project. And many, if not all, of the countries that border the Caribbean Sea are participating in that program and are seeing the benefits of participation in that program, not just for economic development, but also for social good as well. So move to the next. I've used Barbados as a model. It's the area where I've worked for my working life, and I know it better than any other. But also, I believe that we can learn from the mistakes as well as some of the successes of Barbados Coastal and Marine Program. Provide some perspective. Barbados 14 miles wide by 20 miles long. And some might say that because we're so tiny, it is easy to manage coastal and marine areas. But of course, that's not the case. These days, when I think of developing states, I think of them as large ocean developing states. Because they are. And we look out to sea for our economic progress. We're inward to land more. I also see us as large ocean developing states rather than small island developing states. But one of the directions that Barbados has been pursuing for the last few years is that of a green economy. And I've been moving rather swiftly on this, and I'm proud to say that a number of areas, particularly economic areas, which really the pillar of sustainable development that, from observation of countries, it seems to be dragged along last in this issue of sustainable development, believe it or not. But that every aspect of governance and daily life reflect a clear consideration of these three pillars. We've done a study, and we've begun to look at sustainable consumption, production and consumption aspects of the economy. We're looking closer and closer at many capital projects that we are involved in. We're looking at infrastructure development and ensuring that the social and environmental aspects of that infrastructure are also considered, along, of course, with disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. In this heightened period of event activity, we cannot ignore the vulnerability to these hazards. So, strategic plan would stream sustainable development, look at our key sector plans, and they incorporate climate change into the plans that they put together. This is, of course, an ongoing process, and so we're learning as we go, as we do. But I'm sure that this statistic, where to win more than 70% of our national revenue, is not an uncommon one for the Caribbean island states, and it's vulnerable because none of us are able to successfully, if any of us at all, in and all of the challenges, all of the changes in climate that we're seeing at the coast will ultimately affect that 80% of national revenue that we are seeing. Just a little bit of history on the Barbados model before we go too much further. Early 1980s, when Barbados had a very fledgling tourism industry, was growing very fast. There's just saw some very innocuous looking waves like this, and did much of it except that a beach one where this beach was listed among top 10 beaches in the world for several years. One looked like this, and the day it was hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of sand within a few days. And seeing these impacts repeated across the island more and more. So the hoteliers themselves, the private sector, were the ones who the government agitated quite a bit for government to do something about the beaches that they were marketing internationally government responded, even at the time we have any capacity really, and more issues, but we partnered with the Inter-American Development Bank, who provided a technical cooperation grant to look at diagnostic study of the problems that were causing coastal erosion. Think about that in that study, that it answered a number of questions for us. What depths do we have in the coastal zone? What condition are they in that are facing these assets, and the solutions, some of the potential solutions. In terms of the diagnostic study, spoke to the thing needed to be done, but of course was not there. What diagnostic study taught us as a country, however, that science had to be the foundation of whatever we did, because of the value of early science that was conducted. And in order to get to a point where today, this is our most recent stabilization program on the west of Barbados, which is where most of the tourism dollars come from. And more, we've been seeing erosion in this area. We have just completed 1.5 kilometers of stabilization work area. I believe the majority of our hoteliers are pleased with it. But in order to get there, we needed to understand a lot more about the shore climate and all the aspects that I've told you about. So, for example, I hope you see this. Can someone indicate that you can see this, the wave climate in the North Atlantic?
Hello again from the Northeastern University. Yes, we can see this. And also, while I'm interrupting, I want to point out to participants to please post any questions they have for you in the Q&A window so we can ask you the questions at the end. Thank you.
So, under the wind regime, as well as the wave regime in the North Atlantic, to understanding how the waves approach Barbados. What causes a particular kind of wave in Barbados? It's obviously the entire regime that occurs in the North Atlantic. But then it reaches Barbados, and this is a kind of a map of Barbados. Then what happens as it moves around Barbados? It's of water level, direction, and so on. We needed to understand that very clearly. And then how does it take to get back to that levels? How as waves approach the shoreline of any country, significant shallowing of the water. The shape of the subsurface is crucial to slowing down that water. So we needed to understand the topography or bathymetry, as we call it, of our island. Now, this is a three-dimensional model of the near shore bathymetry of Barbados. And on this dimensional model, we are then able to superimpose data of waves and currents and level and so on, wave direction, energy, wave height, and we are able then to see clearly how the waves approach Barbados. Then there is an erosion event such as you see in this slide, where infrastructure is threatened, the major loss of sand in the near shore. Just to give you an idea, from the height of the sand that has been lost from this beach is in excess of 6 feet. We know how the water interacts with the sand. That's really the crucial thing that we'd like to understand. But what happens then when you have events like storm surge? Sea levels, and these things just happen sometimes. But the surge may be associated with tropical cyclones that come across the Caribbean. You want to understand the significant wave height and how that height changes as it passes a small island like Barbados. What we are addressing these is the changing climate challenges that we're seeing in coastal and marine areas. We're attacking it on three tracks, with science underpinning everything. And the track, of course, is conservation and protection. So we have what we call the natural lines of defense, and you know these very well. Your reefs. You can see the waves breaking when they hit the barrier reefs way out to sea. Now, I considered it would be like for your island or country in terms of coral reefs. But that your coastal areas, near shore areas, they would be underwater, and everybody would be moving inland. It is generally accepted that a barrier reef can dissipate up to 70% of the energy associated with waves. And so these are natural lines of defense that are just sitting there, that are helping us, but have allowed our actions, as well as now exacerbated by climate change, to little by little by little. Our line of defense are the fringing reefs, the near shore patches that you see close to shore. And the defense, grass and rubble. The defense would be your beaches and sand dunes. And the fifth line of defense, which Barbados pretty much has none left, are mangrove swamps. But a number of Caribbean islands that do have them. You've got 70 to 90% of the waves dissipated because natural breakwaters. And about the cost of replacing these natural breakwaters, our fringing reefs in Barbados have been lost. And I have a feeling over the last 30 years. And I have a feeling that if we did check, if we were able to do that check throughout the Caribbean, you see, and really throughout the islands of the world, we are seeing pretty thing. So many stressors on these reefs as that have to then begin to look at regulation, which is the next track, in order to some of the issues that we're seeing. We've got damage from the yachts coming in. We've got the land-based sources of marine pollution, tourism pressure, direct pressure, where people experience divers and snorkelers just walk the reef. We've got, of course, the harvesting, and in some of our countries, we've got destructive fishing. Fantastic shock absorbs in terms of floodwater inundation. However, some of them are lost. So many of them are still being lost today, even though we cannot say any longer that we don't know. There are countries, especially even here in the Caribbean, the mangroves are being harvested. without any kind of enforcement. And this is something that we really need to address quickly. Now, the rubble and seagrass are not a lot of help in dissipating energy, but they do offer some. Once the waving of the seagrass, you will get a transfer of energy, a small transfer of energy from the wave. The seagrass when it passes over it. But then, a combination of these 5 natural lines of defense are what we need to ensure that they're taken care of. So, what regulation then? Coastal planning program, and that permitting process that's based on a coastal management plan, imposing conditions on coastal infrastructure that will not further exacerbate the challenges that we're seeing. It also reduces economic vulnerability to coastal hazards, and it deals with some of the social issues as well. Now, this is an example of the coastal zone management area within which that coastal zone management plan is situated. And these sub-areas have, within the sub-area, there are similar features. Outside of the sub-area, you see different features. So, what the Barbados policy framework, we have legislation, and we've got the management plan for the 2 areas of the coast that are complementary. So the things that would be in the coastal zone management plan would be the sectors, manage options for the area, whether the area is prone to erosion, and you might increase the setback requirements for coastal infrastructure. And it also speaks to the role of different agencies as well as community participation. We enforce not just setbacks, but any windows to the sea that may be left on urban coasts. Public access for citizens, control of discharges, protection of vulnerable sites, etc. Now, the final track is try to use as little as possible. However, the onward march of the changes in climate that we're seeing, unfortunately, we have to move to it more and more. And this is the act of coastal engineering, stabilizing the shoreline. When you see or such as beach clearing eroding, it's severely eroded even under normal conditions. We conduct quite a lot of modeling, and we do numerical and physical modeling, where we actually build the beach at a size in a lab in order to ensure that the stabilization structures that we're proposing will not make the situation worse. Over the decades, we've seen a number of structures constructed by the private sector in different countries, and even some by governments. Because of the lack of or the limited design work that was put in, then they finally constructed this even downstream of the structure, virtually deleterious. Make sure by putting the effort and the funding into the design work, we ensure that when we construct, we actually know what is going to occur. So we may have a series of concepts for stabilizing a particular shoreline, and then we set the preferred concept, looking at all of them and the impacts. And the final design may actually be a combination of 2 different concepts. This is an example of one of our complete projects recently. On the left, you see the before, the situation before we intervened. You have a major artery joining a fishing town to the sea. That road was under threat because at high tide, this would disappear and the waves would actually overtop the road, leave sand in the street when low tide came. But what was unknown to those who were using the road was that the road was also being undermined by the seawater, hitting at the bottom. Eventually, that road would just fall. And we designed a solution that would widen the beach, enabling additional recreation, and would reduce the threat to the road. And the bottom right is the final point. The top is just an architect's rendering of the proposed project in advance of construction. The second project that I'll show you is the Rockley, the South Boardwalk. And the South is characterized by a number of small, intricate beaches. This program is not just stabilization, but also enhancement. So, again, the bottom left, at this point, when this picture was taken, this beach was rather wide. But again, at tide, many of these beaches on the south coast would pretty much disappear. And the bottom right is the completed project. This project is 1.5 kilometers, and rather than just doing structures for shoreline stabilization this time, what we did for tourism and recreational purposes, with a boardwalk that has become extremely popular with visitors and locals alike. So we are addressing not just now the disaster risk management and climate change adaptation issues in the coastal zone, but we're also looking at the economic and social issues. For islands such as Barbados, the cost of doing this science is significant. You have an economy that is less than $10 billion US, and we're spending 1 or 2% of that in the economy, trying to protect ourselves and keep our coastal assets where they are. Think about this. Well, how can the policymakers even make a decision regarding, okay, should we keep the beaches where they are, or should we build a new hospital? And the challenges that our policymakers in the region are faced with, frankly, I don't envy them. Because ultimately, you try to shore up the economy so that we get more revenue and we're able to build a hospital. But global skin, the global economy also impacts on us. And this is just an example of our projects. This is not all of the funding that allocated to coastal marine management in the years, but just our capital projects to give you an idea. So ongoing conservation of ecosystem services, regulation through development control, science-based shoreline stabilization, and when the high waves come, we have to make sure we have a proper warning system. Some foundations I'll close with. There are some gaps that we need to fill and fill quickly. The world is moving forward, identifying quickly technologies and methods to start new business areas. And the Caribbean, as far as I'm concerned, is behind in risk of that. Yes, our little islands are moving towards oil and gas where possible. We are supporting our fisheries. What about biotechnology? And any number of other businesses that we are seeing springing up in the developed world in marine areas. So we're talking now about marine spatial planning. be able to maximize value of economic resources for specific areas of our marine space. We want to be able to value the ecosystem services that we get from the assets in the coastal and marine zones. We want to be able to ensure that we can continue with the science that is so important to us when making decisions. I want to close with a quotation that I like. Nothing is more soft and yielding than water. Yet the solid and the strong, none is better. It has no equal. And that too, I've seen it with my eyes in a number of different parts of the world, and I'm sure you have too. Thank you much, and I'll take your questions.
Thanks so much. I mean, if there was ever a place that's living coastal adaptation, it sounds like it's Barbados. So that was really great to hear a survey of all the issues and measures that are being taken to try to cope with that. You're welcome to unmute yourself to ask a question, although it's probably more efficient to have you go through the Q&A function on the WebEx interface. But I have one question from someone who's doing a thesis on threatened historic resources in Puerto Rico. And Maria Fernanda Lopez asks, are coastal historic resources significant in Barbados assessments for coastal flooding? So are you considering historical resources in part of your assessment for coastal flooding and remediation?
Yes, we are. In fact, that has been in the early stages of our feasibility studies. What we needed to understand was the impact that previous events have had on Barbados, and in some cases, of course, a best estimate was required to be used. In other cases, we needed to look at anecdotal evidence because that's all we had. However, we have been able to build a history of higher-level events that have approached Barbados, and that is in our GIS database. We are currently building a national coastal risk information and planning platform, or an ENCRIP as we call it, where we will incorporate all of the data that we have been able to gather in terms of the history or produced in the more than 30 years that we've been in business, and to inform the decisions that we take with respect to coastal and marine areas, and also to be able to improve the resilience of the country as a whole to these coastal hazards.
I think, to clarify, I think it was more about like historic structures and other historical artifacts that may be threatened by sea level change.
Oh.
So no, I just when I asked the question.
Okay. So what she's talking about is archaeology.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. That is new to Barbados. We finally for the UNESCO has a program that deals with marine heritage, and we have begun participating in that in the program just during the last 2 to 3 years. So we are still very new to that. And I expect that we will be able to incorporate it into our planning and implementation plans as we move forward.
This next question is from Dr. Hammond, who is actually the principal investigator for the SAGE project. He says you answered the question on what interventions you're using. Can you comment more on whether private property is contributing to the cost of stabilization, and where is any opportunity for the return of increased land value back to government, assuming stabilization?
Yeah. New coastal risk assessment and management program has a component in it which we haven't started yet. We will be doing it over the next 2 years. Called recovery options. So far, the shoreline stabilization programs have been government-centric. No doubt about that. That means that we have not had private sector and private property owners who have been protecting their own properties and had major input, not providing technical advice, but from a regulatory perspective. Their structures constitute development. They go through the planning and permitting process, and we make recommendations. Now, we make those recommendations in advance. Many of them come to us before they submit their application for a permit, like water or growing, etc. And we're able to provide technical advice and in preliminary screening. This is something that we would not accept. We think that you should consider this, and so we see contribution in terms of protecting their own property. However, in terms of the wider projects that government is implementing, they expect that these cost recovery options, we hope these cost recovery options will be taken up by the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs. We have been discussing for a number of years the position of a development tax in relation with projects that the Coastal Zone Management Unit implements. Of course, that goes beyond our remit, and we are aware that, of course, it's an issue of policy and politics in this case, but we anticipate that moving forward, particularly as we go into marine spatial planning, I need to understand how government will maximize revenues from private sector businesses working in the blue economy. We need to be able to understand how returns, even from the use of these coastal and marine assets, will come to government. So I anticipate that once we go through that particular component of the project, of the program, that we'll have some discussions with the economists, and we may be able to force the issue a little bit in order to get some returns to government.
Another question, a little bit related, is that what is the status of the regulatory environment for climate change adaptation, national government planning exercises? Is there a policy that requires these considerations to be taken into account? A little bit already, so I don't want to.
Yeah. Okay. Could you just repeat the early part so perhaps I can tease out some of the.
Yeah. So the question is, what status of the regulatory environment for requiring climate change adaptation to be incorporated in government planning exercises? Is there a policy that requires these considerations? And whoever asks this question may want to unmute themselves and maybe clarify that a little bit if they'd like to. But I'll answer it, Dr. Inniss, if you can.
Thank you. Yes, of course. I've described our regulatory framework in terms of infrastructure development. However, the Department of Emergency Management, which represents the national coordinator for risk management and climate change adaptation, really, for the government of Barbados, has a Disaster Management Act. And the Act to institute a National Mitigation Council. Act calls for a comprehensive mainstreaming of disaster risk management, climate change adaptation into planning. We have embraced the policy, what is really a regional policy on disaster management, which is being utilized by the Caribbean community countries. And so the coordinator for that, the Department of Emergency Management, is rolling out the Hazard Mitigation Council. They also have a council of permanent secretaries who would approve necessary changes to policy led by the minister with responsibility for disaster management. And those policy changes are being incorporated little by little. The council was only instituted, I believe, last year, so still very new to this. But I believe that we're going in the right direction. And once we are able then to let that National Coastal Risk Information and Planning Platform, Department of Emergency Management, and indeed the wider National Emergency Management System would need in terms of information from science to inform their decisions, I believe that we will see a much wider rolling out across all ministries, all activities of government. We're not just regulation, but even just policy and practice, so that we are able to achieve sustainable development in the coastal zone and marine areas.
We're at the end of our time, so I know there was one or two other questions, but perhaps those can be addressed individually to Dr. Inniss. I just want to thank her again for a fantastic talk. I mean, it really was really brought to life what's going on with coastal adaptation, and it was a great way to finish off our series for this academic year. So, Dr. Inniss, thank you so much for making the time to do this. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I also want to make sure people who are still on, and a number of you are still on, know that this webinar, as well as all the others that we have had this year, are actually on our YouTube account, which is titled SAGE Resilient-Infrastructure, and you can find the other posted there. And Innis's webinar will be posted there shortly. So if you would like to see hers again, or look at other parts again, or see the others that were posted from earlier this year, go to the YouTube channel where these are being posted. So very much again, Dr. Inniss, and thanks to everyone who attended, and have a good day.
Dr. Inniss. This is Ann. I'm not sure if you noticed the chat window or the Q&A. If you want to take a look at that, or do you want me to unmute the attendees that still have questions? They are still online right now, and I can unmute them so they can ask you directly. What are you comfortable with?
Yeah, you can unmute them. Let's have a talk.
Okay, so, Cynthia, are you still there? Do you have a question?
Price. It's a price item.
Okay. Actually, it's probably best if they provide your email address. Would that be possible?
I had it on the last slide. Should I just share my screen again?
Yeah,
it would be awesome, and that way they can all write down your email and then contact you.
Okay, let's see. How is this system? So let's see, share screen. Okay, and then I'll put one back up.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I'll just keep the webinar on for a couple more minutes so people can take down this contact information. Thank you. And I will mute you now, though.
Thank you.